Hello, everyone. Good evening. Today, Professor Williamson will give his third talk, third lecture, Philosophy and Clarification. Welcome. Okay? Yeah.
Right, thank you. So I'm going to begin today by just saying a few very impressionistic things about the historical background to a lot of debates about philosophical method, in fact, about both the aims and the methods of philosophy. And this has to do with philosophy and the scientific revolution, which is something that's often not made explicit in these discussions. But I think it's there as an implicit presence, and I think it makes better sense of quite a lot of the ways things have gone. I'm going to be talking in a very big picture way. I'm not going to try to be historically very nuanced, but I think the big picture is important. So I think in the long run, the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries caused a gradually intensifying crisis of aims and methods in philosophy. And that's the background that we need to understand. I don't think it was something that, as it were, developed very quickly, but I think it, as it were, gradually became more and more pressing. So one thing that happened in that period was that the distinction emerged that we now make between philosophy and natural science. But in the early period, and even in the up to the 18th century, what we would now call natural science was called natural philosophy in English, and corresponding terms in other languages. But it gradually diverged from philosophy in the way that it proceeded, and from philosophy in a narrower sense, something more like the modern sense, and what had been called natural philosophy, and so regarded as a branch of philosophy, later became known as natural science, and was thought of as something quite disjoint from philosophy. Now, the crisis that I'm talking about has been worst for metaphysics, as metaphysics is looks like the most problematic branch of philosophy in this respect, because it seems to be in the most competition with natural science. So they both seem to be aiming to give a very general description of the world, but metaphysics seems to have no methods that would compete with the new sciences' experiments and measurements and observations and so on. And so it looked as though, as it were, metaphysics was trying to answer the same questions as the natural sciences, in particular as physics, but just doing it by, as people say, sitting in an armchair and thinking about how the world must be, rather than going to the world and interacting with it and finding out how it actually is. And so it was danger of metaphysics looking like the lazy man's physics, where we didn't really bother to do the experiments that are needed. And so it seemed that metaphysics was going into competition with natural science, but a competition that it was bound to lose because it simply didn't have the high-powered new methods of the developing natural sciences. And I think that crisis also affected other branches of philosophy, though perhaps not in quite such a direct way. And as I say, as natural science became more and more separate from philosophy and more successful, the crisis became worse. I mean, not a crisis in the sense of one immediate, as it were, a moment of crisis, but something that a problematic challenge for philosophy that has become more and more severe. So I think the case of geometry, even though it's technically a branch of mathematics rather than philosophy, but I think the methodological questions that it raised are worth thinking about in this light, and they had some implications for what people believed could be achieved by, as it were, the kind of armchair methods or a priori reflection typical of philosophy. So for a very long time, Euclidean geometry seemed like a case where a priori reflection, just as in philosophy, had yielded significant knowledge of physical space by allowing us to make deductions from self-evident axioms. And this was a model that was quite influential in areas of philosophy. And I think a classic case of that is Spinoza in the Ethics, who tried to apply the Euclidean methodology to ethics. And I mean, that's very explicit in the sort of structure that he gives with this kind of imitation of Euclid's geometry. And I think that was because it could still look as though Euclidean geometry was a kind of paradigm of how we could gain this kind of knowledge by as I say, finding some axioms that would be self-evident to reflection, and then drawing out in more and more extended ways the consequences of those axioms. And that knowledge seemed to be very non-trivial, very substantial, even if physical space was not constitutively independent of our experience. So even if you think of physical space as something that in some way represents the structure of our experience rather than the structure of the world as it is in itself, it still would be the case, it seems, that Euclidean geometry would be very substantial knowledge of that space. But famously, the 19th century discovery by various mathematicians of consistent non-Euclidean geometries where the parallels postulate was denied, they undermined the a priori arguments for physical space being Euclidean, because that the axiom that was the postulate was denied, as it were, it seemed not totally self-evident, and these non-Euclidean geometries did not get into any kind of contradiction as people had hoped they would. Now, of course, originally these non-Euclidean geometries were, as it was something of a mathematical exercise. But then the problem became much worse when the scientific evidence emerged through the work of Einstein and others that physical space, or actually space-time itself, is non-Euclidean. So that it's not just that an alternative to Euclidean geometry seems to be, as it were, logically consistent, but there's evidence that it is in fact correct, and therefore that Euclidean geometry is not only it's not just that it's not logically compelling, but it's not even true of physical space or space-time. Now, if we fast forward to the situation today, it's that if we think of geometry as a part of mathematics, it's still, in a loose sense, a priori. It's done by standard mathematical methods, but it isn't understood as studying physical space in the sense of, as it would, it's making claims which are responsible to the actual structure of physical space. I mean, instead, we've got various axioms for different kinds of geometry, which can be studied just as abstract formulas whose consequences can be drawn out by logical mathematical reasoning, but which are not required to be interpreted in terms of physical space or space-time. And so it's a branch of mathematics whose methodology is pretty similar to that of other branches of mathematics, and it's really just looking at taking the axioms to define various classes of structures, and then it's proving theorems about what holds in all structures of that kind. I mean, results of that sort. Whereas if we want to study what physical space or space-time is like, then that study is going to be a posteriori. It's going to involve actual experiments, and it will be a part of physics, not part of mathematics, strictly speaking. So, I mean, the idea of Euclidean geometry as a kind of paradigm of how a priori reflection could yield substantial knowledge of how the world is, that idea has collapsed. And since although this geometry wasn't itself regarded as part of philosophy, but it was, as in the case of Spinoza, it was a kind of inspiration for philosophers who were looking for the most rigorous ways to proceed. I think another aspect of the way in which the scientific revolution has impacted on philosophy concerns what we now call the philosophy of mind. So, you might think, well, if we can't use our a priori reflective methods to study how the external world is structured, we might still be able to use those methods to investigate how the internal world of the mind is structured. And so you can see various kinds of attempts to think of philosophy that way, which of course already involves a huge scaling down of philosophy's aims and ambitions, if it's not going to try to investigate the external world, but is just concerned with our own minds or whatever. But but even thinking of philosophy as a kind of a priori investigation of the mind, it eventually faced a similar threat from the development of experimental psychology in the 19th century. I mean, so experimental psychology, it diverged from philosophy much later than physics and some of the other natural sciences did. But and it was really in the 19th century, not the 17th and 18th centuries that happened. And in fact, when I was my first teaching job was in Trinity College Dublin in Ireland, and I was part of. I mean, philosophy was part of the School of Mental and Moral Science, and the mental science there had originally, I think, been psychology in effect, but that had separated from philosophy, but much more recently than physics and biology had separated from philosophy, for example. So again, it seemed like philosophy was competing with a natural science, or if you like, a social science, if you think of psychology that way, at a methodological disadvantage, because the psychologists were doing, as it were, proper experiments, whereas the philosophers were not. I mean, actually, someone like David Hume, I mean, described what he was doing, in effect, in what we might now call philosophy of mind, but which was to some extent psychology, as using an experimental method. But the experiments that he was doing, they were very unsystematic and sort of introspective ones by comparison with what a lot of psychology was doing. Although, of course, the introspectionist psychology was a big thing in the late 19th century, but it was doing the kind of experiments that you needed a laboratory to do, rather than as well the kind that a philosopher might do in their study. So, I mean, one way of thinking of the challenge that this posed to philosophy in general is apparent competition with the natural sciences, is a kind of potential mismatch between philosophy's traditional aims and its traditional methods. That the traditional aims seem to be to, as it were, to get knowledge of how the world is in its broad structure, or perhaps how some aspects of the world are. But then it looked as though the kind of methods of philosophy, which seemed to be broadly the kind that you can just apply sitting in an armchair, that those traditional methods of a priori reflection did not seem appropriate by comparison with those of the natural sciences, including psychology here, to the kind of questions that were being raised. I mean, that at least the methods of sciences that were using measurement and experimentation seemed much more appropriate. And so, of course, that raised the question, well, if philosophy's traditional a priori approach is not really good for answering those questions, what is it good for? And of course, we could also just take the view that we should just abandon philosophy as an obsolete discipline, just stop doing it and maybe join the natural scientists. or that we should keep the methods of philosophy. We should still keep doing philosophy as we've traditionally done it, but just try to redefine our aims so that the methods that we're using are better adapted to those aims. So, I mean, a slightly strange idea that in a way we should carry on much as before, but just redefining which race we're running in. And so it has seemed to various people that philosophy might simply be an obsolete discipline. I remember once, again, actually, when I was in my first teaching job at Trinity College Dublin, where a biochemist there once asked me whether many British universities still had a philosophy department. So he was thinking of a philosophy department as some kind of obsolete survival that he was thinking most British universities might have abolished, but because the force of history and tradition and inertia was stronger in Dublin, that somehow a philosophy department had anomalously survived there. So that's the way in which philosophy can look scarily obsolete to some natural scientists. So I think under this kind of pressure, in the 20th century, a number of philosophers thought of much more radical revision of the postulated aims of philosophy, and in effect, to cease to regard philosophy as fundamentally aiming at knowledge at all. And if it's not aiming at knowledge, then it's presumably it's not competing with science. Of course, I'm assuming here that that's in some broad sense, science does aim at knowledge. But I think if the aims of science were redefined in terms of some other cognitive state, then there would be a corresponding claim amongst these radical revisionists that philosophy doesn't aim at that state, whatever it is that the natural sciences aim at. And then, of course, the question is, well, if philosophy doesn't aim at knowledge, what does it aim at? If it's not aiming at the same kind of thing as the sciences aim at, what does it aim at? So one way that we might get to a proposed answer is by thinking that, of course, on the sort of view that we're talking about, I mean, knowledge, if we're thinking of that as the aim of the sciences, it's still expressed in a language, because it has to be communicated, as we were talking about in the previous lecture. And I'm, at least in the case of propositional knowledge, and by propositional knowledge, I mean knowledge that something is the case. And then the picture might be that language can express knowledge because it's rule governed. That's why how it has the necessary structure and, as it were, discipline to be capable of expressing scientific knowledge. And then you might think, well, if the language has these rules which enable it to express knowledge, then whose job is it to look after the rules of the knowledge, to make sure that, as it were, the rule book is sufficiently clear and that it's being properly applied and so on? And putting it very crudely, the proposal might be that it's philosophy's job to look after the rules of the language. It's not philosophy's job, as it were, to use the rule-governed language then to express knowledge. It's that they keep the language in a working state where it's capable of expressing language in the first, of expressing knowledge in the first place. And I mean, again, speaking in a very crude, broad brush way, but both Rudolf Carnap and Ludwig Wittgenstein had versions of this idea. I mean, versions with different flavors, but there was also something in common between the way that they were approaching it. Of course, Carnap was much more interested in scientific language, and Wittgenstein in ordinary language. But some of I mean, there was some commonality between their views. So what I'm going to do is to, in the next section of the lecture, I'm going to be just giving a sketch of the kind of views that you might get within this approach, and which I'm calling, as using the traditional phrase, the linguistic turn. So one version of this would be that when philosophers make what seem like factual statements, as it were, things which look like factual statements, they're not really making factual statements at all. They're really just expressing linguistic rules. And then we can make a distinction within such expression, which corresponds to a distinction between two kinds of metaphysics, which Peter Strawson makes in the preface to his book Individuals. He distinguishes between descriptive metaphysics and revisionary metaphysics, but we can apply this distinction more broadly. So the idea is that descriptive philosophy expresses rules that are already in force in the language, whereas revisionary philosophy proposes new rules to be put into force. And certainly, as Strawson was thinking of it, he thought that insofar as the new rules were supposed to replace the old rules, that they were straying into nonsense. But that, I mean, you could be more open to revisionary proposals than Strawson was, and still make this distinction. In fact, I mean, Carnap's an example of someone who was very open to all sorts of combinations of rules, but I mean, they would only replace the old rules in the sense, in his view, that for some practical purpose we decided to speak a language with the new rules rather than language with the old rules. It wouldn't be that the old rules were somehow false. And so a sort of classic example of this approach is with the statement, let's say, made by a Platonist in the philosophy of mathematics, that there are numbers, which it looks like a statement such as a scientist might make, let's say, that there are black swans. But on Carnap's view, insofar as anything substantial is happening here, what's going on is really a proposal to speak a language where it's one of the rules of the language that we can correctly utter the sentence that there are numbers, something like that. It's not a statement about what there is, as it were, to be found in the world. Now, just to comment on the terminology, which when we have such an apparent statement which expresses the rules in force in a given language, that will be called, with respect to that language, a conceptual truth or an analytic truth in a rather broad sense of analytic, which is now common in contemporary philosophy. And then, of course, the other truths are called synthetic. So, for example, the claim that nothing is both round and square would count as a conceptual truth or an analytic truth on this sort of view. It's not supposed to be a discovery about how the world is, but simply an expression of the rules of our language. And it's also going to be part of this view that changing the rules of a language changes the meaning of the relevant expressions, because their meaning is constituted by the rules. And so in effect, it's a new language after the change. I mean, it might have quite a lot in common with the old language, but still, strictly speaking, it's a new language. And then someone who challenges a conceptual truth, for example, by insisting that some things are round and square, the idea is that they're not disagreeing factually with other speakers of the language, but in effect, what they're doing is just proposing to change the rules of the language. And there may be practical reasons for or against making such a change, but it's not because the change is somehow one from an inaccurate way of speaking to an accurate, or from an incorrect to a correct way of speaking. It's just that speaking in a new kind of language may better serve, for example, the purposes of science. And of course, we've got to be careful here, because words are not all unambiguous. They may have different uses, and such that they're subject to one set of rules in one use, and to a different set of rules in another use. Maybe the word has different meanings in these different rules. What I mean is that the word has different meanings, in a context in which one set of rules is operative from the meaning that it has in a different context where a different set of rules is operative. And then the sort of work that is supposed to be left on this view for philosophers to do is that they can clear up apparent disagreements by showing that the two sides are using the same expression subject to different rules, and so that there was no factual disagreement, just a misunderstanding. What one side was asserting was not what the other side was denying. The two sides were talking past each other. And philosophers might also use this kind of technique to clear up philosophical paradoxes and puzzles, because if people, in using a given expression, are not consistently separating different sets of rules that it can be used according to in different contexts, and that they're somehow combining the rules that it's used according to in one context with the rules that it's used according to in another context, and as we're lumping all those rules together, then the result might well be some kind of inconsistency or contradiction. And then it would be the philosopher's job to dissolve the supposed philosophical problem by explaining what had been going on. Now, a lot of the time, rather than talking about words in this sort of connection, you find philosophers talking about concepts. And in fact, that was already implicit in the terminology of conceptual truth that I was mentioning a couple of slides back. So I want to say something about the relation between words and concepts. Because often it seems that what we're facing is not a linguistic turn, but something like a conceptual turn, although the difference is not huge, in fact. So if we've got two words which are subject to the same rules, for example, the word red in English and the word rouge in French, which is just a translation of red into French, then if that's the only difference between them, it's not philosophically significant. We're not interested in saying the kind of thing about red that we could not say about rouge. And so in order to focus on what's philosophically interesting, we want to abstract away from the difference, such as the difference between red and rouge. And one way of making that step of abstraction is by saying that the two words express the same concept. And so the idea is that we're abstracting away from the phonetic properties of the word itself and looking just at fundamentally at the implicit rules that it's used according to, which are supposed to be the same between red and rouge. And then if we've got the same word which is subject to different rules in two different contexts, then we'll say that it expresses different concepts in those contexts. And a lot of the philosophical moves which are associated with the phrase, the linguistic turn, they can also be rephrased in terms of concepts. And so philosophers, can be tasked with clarifying or analyzing concepts and tracing conceptual connections, where we might have talked about them clarifying or analyzing certain words and tracing linguistic connections. But this is meant to be, as far as philosophers are concerned, the same sort of activity. And of course, a lot of this activity was traditionally associated with the idea of conceptual analysis. And because of the use of the phrase analytic philosophy, I mean, sort of natural for people to assume that analytic philosophy is in the business of producing conceptual analyses, even though, in fact, if you look at contemporary analytic philosophy, that is not such a central task anymore, but it certainly was at one time. So when we're talking about conceptual analyses, what we're talking about is, I take it, the identity of concept. At least this seems like the most natural notion of what we're getting from a conceptual analysis. And typically the way these analyses are expressed is with the concept being expressed by a single word on one side and by a complex expression on the other. So just to take the classic example, the concept bachelor is supposed to be identical with the concept unmarried adult male human. Notice that if we were talking about the linguistic expressions, they're not identical. The word bachelor is not identical with the expression unmarried adult male human. For example, the word bachelor begins with a B, but the expression unmarried adult male human does not begin with a B. But we're abstracting away from those unimportant differences, and then we're getting we're analyzing the concept by showing that it can be expressed in terms, as it were, roughly speaking, in simpler terms. And then we might express this concept identity according to this sort of view of conceptual analysis by saying something like, to be a bachelor is to be an unmarried adult male human, where we're not explicitly talking about concepts, but the idea is that we're implicitly talking about them. And we might even just say something like, every unmarried adult male human is a bachelor. And of course, vice versa, that every bachelor is an unmarried adult male human, where we just seem to be dealing with an ordinary extensional generalization, but the idea is what is really going on is the expression of this conceptual analysis, which itself, it just has to do with the rules governing the term bachelor being tied to the rules governing the unmarried adult male human. Now, when people talk about conceptual connections, as for example Strawson did, they're typically talking about conceptual truths which do not take the form of conceptual analyses. So, for example, to use one that we had before, if you say nothing is both round and square, that's not a conceptual analysis of anything. It doesn't give you an analysis of round in terms of square, or of square in terms of round. I mean, round is not equivalent to not square, because all sorts of things are neither round nor square. And similarly, square is not equivalent to not round. But the idea is that although this may not be a conceptual analysis, it's still a conceptual truth, and because it gives some kind of connection, in this case, the negative connection between the concepts round and square. And I mean, sometimes you get a narrower use of the term analytic, so that it only applies to things that take the form of conceptual analyses, but doesn't apply to these conceptual connections. But in contemporary philosophy, I think the word analytic also gets applied to these broader conceptual connections. And then it's in this connection, it's also worth mentioning conceptual engineering, which is a kind of very trendy, fashionable idea at the moment. So conceptual engineering is supposed to be, if you at least taken at face value, it's a project of constructing new concepts to serve some purpose, often by replacing old concepts. And so, in effect, the construction will involve devising new conceptual rules to govern this new concept, which, for example, might be more relevant to current social conditions, or more relevant to some new developments in science. So, conceptual engineering is supposed to be something that happens a lot in science, so that one engineered concept is the concept of a gene, which is required by contemporary biology, but was not used 200 years ago. But we also get examples in politics, like the concept of cancel culture, which has become very much talked about in the last few months, in fact. And I mean, it's supposed to refer to a sort of culture in which people who who violate norms of political correctness get cancelled in the sense that you're not supposed to invite them to give lectures and that sort of thing. And then another example of a concept which is actually not as anything like as new as the concept cancel culture is the concept kitsch, for a certain kind of bad taste art, maybe, for example, rather sentimental, pretentious art. So these are cases where new concepts have been devised to meet new scientific or social or political needs. So far, I've just been describing the sort of views associated with a linguistic turn and with, as it were, a conceptual modulation of that. And now I want to turn to criticism of that way of thinking. So even the very contemporary talk of conceptual truths and conceptual connections and so on, if it's taken at face value, fundamentally it depends on some version of the analytic synthetic distinction, not the very narrow version of the analytic that just corresponds to conceptual analyses, but to the broader notion, which is more like the notion of conceptual truth. And of course, such a distinction has been in some way problematic since Quine's critique of it into Dogmas of Empiricism, something like 70 years ago. And of course, Quine was complaining that it's quite unclear which truths are going to count as analytic or conceptual, that proper evidence is lacking for the rules of the kind that the theory of analytic or conceptual truths posits. And so just to give an example of why this is problematic, I mean, take someone who says that an adult male human who's been separated but not divorced from his wife is a married bachelor, which of course violates what are supposed to be the rules for using the term bachelor. And I mean, I'm not endorsing that view, but I think it's the case that we have not been provided with any proper method for determining whether he's violating a rule of the language or just challenging a common sense belief. I mean, you can say, look, he's insisting that we use the word bachelor in a new way, but the person who says that may be insistent that he's actually challenging, a widespread belief that such a person is that it's impossible to have a married bachelor, and that he thinks that there are examples of this, and you can find philosophers who are native speakers of English. I mean, people like Gilbert Harman and Robert Nozick and so on, who are sympathetic to such examples. So it's very hard to rule that somebody who makes a claim like this simply doesn't understand the word bachelor, for example, because it may be that by any normal standard they're a completely fluent speaker of English, and it does not seem appropriate to tell them that what they have to do is to go back to language school, or not back to it, but to go and take a course in speaking English. But I mean, Quine's critique itself is not really very satisfactory as it stands. I mean, one way in which it's too radical is that it attacks the idea of synonymy, because for reasons which will emerge in a while, his critique of the analytic synthetic distinction also requires him to criticize a number of related distinctions, and one of them is the distinction between synonymous and non-synonymous words. In other words, the distinction between pairs of words which are the same in meaning and pairs of words which differ in meaning. And you know, if you, I mean, forgetting about philosophers' commitments, if you just think about semantics as a branch of linguistics, the notion of synonymy seems fine there. It's one which is frequently used by linguists. And it seems that any well-developed theory of meaning will give you some kind of definition of sameness of meaning. So that if Quine's critique requires him to attack the notion of synonymy or sameness of meaning, then it actually seems to be clashing with what semanticists within linguistics are doing. And it's also the case that a lot of Quine's critique depended on a behaviorist methodology for the social sciences, where he was looking for some kind of behavioral standard for synonymy. And that kind of behaviorist methodology has really been outdated in both linguistics and in cognitive psychology since Chomsky's famous critical review of B.F. Skinner's book on linguistic behavior in the late 1950s. And so if you judge Quine's original critique by modern standards, it actually looks rather anti-scientific. And so it can't be considered as a definitive takedown of the analytic synthetic distinction. Now, suppose that we regard the notion of synonymy, of sameness of meaning, as an acceptable idea because it's just either implicit or explicit in a whole lot of what semantics as a branch of linguistics does. I mean, there might be different notions of synonymy, but some notion of synonymy is going to be available. Then the critical question is whether, given the idea of synonymy, we can use it to define an idea of analyticity. Because we need, or analyticity in some broad sense of something like conceptual truth. Because the theory of concepts of the kind that I was describing before, it needs analyticity as well as synonymy, because it needs the notion of conceptual truth and conceptual connection. So if we didn't have that, we wouldn't really have much of a theory. And so the question is, if we take the idea of synonymy from semantics, can we use it to explain the idea of analyticity? And it was part of Quine's critique to suggest that these two go together. Never mind about the definition of synonymy in terms of analyticity, but he thought if we're given the idea of synonymy, we could define what it is for a sentence to be analytic by saying that for a sentence to be analytic is for it to be synonymous with some logical truth. So, for example, if you take something like bachelors are unmarried, given that bachelor is supposed to be synonymous with unmarried adult male human, then bachelors are unmarried would just be something like unmarried adult male humans are unmarried, which would be a logical truth. And Quine was granting, for the purposes of his critique, that a precise idea of logical truth can be rigorously defined. And so for Quine, he had to reject the idea of synonymous sentences because if he granted it, he thought that he would have to grant a notion of the analytic via this definition. Now let's just focus on this definition for a minute. So to be analytic is to be synonymous with a logical truth. Now, one very trivial consequence of this explanation of analyticity is that automatically any logical truth counts as analytic, and that's simply because any sentence is synonymous with itself, and if it is a logical truth, it's synonymous with a logical truth itself. And so, as it were, logical truths get to be analytic according to this definition just for free. They don't have to really do anything or have any very special features other than logical truth to count as analytic. But that doesn't really fit the kind of picture of analyticity or conceptual truth that defenders of the notion have tended to have, or at least we need to check whether it fits it or not. Because the idea is that logical truths are not telling us anything substantial. Analytic truths are not telling us anything substantial. They're just expressions of rules, linguistic rules. And so the question is, well, is it the case that if something's a logical truth, that it's automatically just an expression of linguistic rules? And that, as I say, that doesn't really fit the standard account of logical truth. And the standard account of logical truth is that it's just something that is true on all interpretations, all interpretations which preserve the intended meanings of the logical constant. So, for example, all frogs are frogs is a logical truth, because as long as you preserve the meaning of all and are, it doesn't really matter what the meaning of frog is. I mean, even if we rephrase, we reinterpreted a frog to mean a dog or something, it would still be true because all dogs are dogs. So if we look at a definition like that of logical truth, it gives no particular epistemic or linguistic privilege to logical truths. And one way of seeing that is to think of certain sentences which are composed entirely of logical constants. They don't have any non-logical terms in them. And then for them, there's no difference between truth and logical truth, because if they're completely made up of logical constants, and we're preserving the intended meaning of all the logical constants, then we preserve the meaning of the sentence itself. And so that we're not really looking at any interpretations except the original one of the sentence. And that's why such a sentence composed in that way is true if and only if it's logically true. And I mean, there are examples of that. For example, the sentence which says in effect that there are at least 29 objects that it can be formulated in a way where it is composed entirely of logical constants. And since it's true, it's logically true. But it doesn't seem that it has any very obvious epistemic or linguistic privilege. And so it seems that Quine's explanation of analyticity in terms of, on his view, the equally problematic notion of synonymy is not really something that a theorist who's a friend of concepts should be adopting, because it's just presupposing a certain status for logical truths, which really needs to be separately argued for in terms of showing that logical truths themselves have this kind of expressive status. And so once we see that, I think it emerges that, unlike synonymy, analyticity does not have a secure place in semantics as a branch of linguistics. Analyticity is not something that just automatically comes out of an account of meaning. I mean, you can get various notions that maybe a certain notion of necessity or whatever that come out of an account of meaning, but something like analyticity is not really given you by a standard semantic account of a language. But that's worrying for the proponents of the linguistic turn, because and friends of analyticity, because if the linguistic rules that they're positing really existed, then they ought to be something which turn up. I mean, are found by the linguists, because they're supposed to be just describing how the language in effect works. But the linguists are not working with notions like that on the whole. So that I think that makes it doubtful that there are any of the kind of linguistic rules, or at least all of the kind of linguistic rules that they're positing, because an investigation of the language doesn't really show up such rules. I mean, shows up various linguistic rules, but they don't seem to be the kind of rules that are posited by friends of analyticity on the whole. I mean, of course, different theories of linguistics differ a bit, but the notion of analyticity is not central to semantics in the way that the notion of synonymy is at all. I think there's another different kind of reason for saying that synonymy in linguistics is also not what these theorists of concepts need. So just to give an example of what I'm talking about, let's take the English words furs and gorse, which are, as normally used, they're just synonyms. They're simply two different words for the same kind of plant. It's a kind of bush, which I know well because I was brought up in Scotland, where there's lots and lots of this plant. Now, you could have a rational speaker who learns furs in summer in the normal way by just being shown some of these bushes, and then learns gorse in winter by being shown some of these bushes. But they might not know that they're talking about the very same kind of bush, because this bush it changes its appearance between I guess roughly between summer and winter. Summer it has it's sort of green with lots of yellow flowers, and in winter it's just brown with no flowers. And so although this speaker would count by ordinary standards as competent with a natural kind term, because you don't need to have lots of special botanical knowledge to count as competent with a botanical term in ordinary language. I mean, the speaker might accept furs is furs and reject furs is gorse. And by ordinary standards, furs is furs and furs is gorse actually have the same meaning, because all we've done is to substitute one word for another in the sentence. which have the very same meaning. And since the meaning of the whole sentence is built up out of the meanings of the words in it, the two sentences have the same meaning. But nevertheless, the speaker is taking different attitudes to these sentences, accepting one and rejecting the other. They think that these two terms refer to a different sort of plan. And it's not that they're being crazily irrational or anything like that. And so it seems that in cases like this, the synonymy of the terms is actually not cognitively available, even to a speaker who's, by ordinary standards, is competent with the terms, and most of the time the friends of conceptual truth and so on, they're just talking about the ordinary meanings of their terms. They're not talking about them as used, but as scientific terms. And so, although furs, and presumably furs is furs, counts as a conceptual truth, but it seems that for these speakers, furs is gorse does not count as a conceptual truth. I mean, they're not showing some kind of irrationality or linguistic incompetence by not accepting furs is gorse. And so it seems that the ordinary standard of synonymy in linguistics is also not working the way that theorists of concepts need it to do. And so they're not getting the support from linguistics that they might have hoped for. So what I'm suggesting here is that the Quine's conclusion was correct, even though his argument for it wasn't. That the analytic synthetic distinction and the terms concept, conceptual truth, conceptual analysis, and conceptual connection, they're not backed in the way they need to be by a plausible theory. They're not fit for purpose and should be abandoned. So in other words, the investigation of language just doesn't reveal that it's structured in the way that these kinds of theory require it to be. And there just doesn't seem to be an effective theory which is backed by the kind of evidence it would need to have in order to indicate these distinctions. And since these distinctions are really needed for the account of philosophical method as conceptual clarification, it should just be abandoned. So I'm going to give some further arguments for that conclusion that we should not be thinking of philosophy as engaged primarily in conceptual clarification. So one further point that's worth clearing up is that, worth emphasizing, so although the method of philosophy as conceptual clarification was supposed to be based on rules, at least in the case of natural language, which are available to any competent speaker of the language, in practice, it wasn't that by using this methodology that philosophers could avoid the kind of all the disputes and disagreements that philosophy traditionally got into, and could simply just uncontroversially just clarify what was going on. In practice, it involves just as much controversy as other philosophical methods. So it doesn't make philosophy as were somehow any easier. Because the trouble is that its appeals to alleged linguistic rules mask philosophical dogmatism as linguistic competence. So philosophers can they insist on some philosophical claim, by asserting that it's a conceptual truth, and so that anybody who doesn't understand it is linguistically incompetent, or who doesn't assent to it is linguistically incompetent. But there's no real basis for these claims. It's actually I mean, it's not that we're reaching the kind of consensus that you would expect if we were really talking about the rules of a game that we're all playing, and that all competent speakers are implicitly respecting. Another way of thinking of the view that I've been talking about is that clarifying concepts was proposed as an alternative aim for philosophy, which was contrasted with gaining knowledge. And so people who take this view, they often say that that what philosophy provides is not knowledge, but understanding. And so I think it's worth pressing on this issue of what the distinction between understanding and knowledge is supposed to be. So when you ask what the difference is supposed to be between understanding and knowing, what you're often told is that you can know, for example, that an event happened without understanding why it happened. And that's true, but it commits a very bad methodological fallacy, because the understanding why and knowing that, they differ not only in the verb, but also in what follows the verb. And it might be that the main distinction is really coming from the difference between the that and the why, rather than from the difference between the know and the understand. And in fact, that seems to be confirmed, because you can know that an event happened without knowing why it happened. This word knowing why it happened requires knowing a further fact about it beyond just that it did happen. And so that seems to be the place to look at. And it's also the case that there seems to be a very close connection between understanding and knowing, because you can't understand why an event happened unless you also know why it happened. If you don't know why it happened, then you don't understand why it happened. And it's not clear that you can know why it happened without understanding why it happened. So knowing why something happened, or knowing why something, more generally, knowing why something is the case, is in fact very close to understanding why it's the case. And if you look at, for example, in English, the way that people talk about understanding, I understand that something is the case. The way it's used is very close to knowing that something is the case. It's just that normally we tend to use the word understand followed by the words why and how, rather than much more than like that. So I think this distinction between knowledge and understanding is not nearly as robust enough to be useful in defining a separate aim for philosophy that doesn't require knowledge. So I want now to say something a bit about the clarification, and so we don't really need the whole ideology of concepts to talk about clarifying words. For example, making explicit some ambiguity in them or something like that. So without worrying about concepts, we can still talk about clarifying words. But clarifying one's terms is something that happens all over the place. It's not just something that philosophers do. In most academic disciplines, from time to time, people feel the need to clarify the terms that they're using, either to give them explicit definitions or at least to give them enough explanation to make it clear what distinction they're using these words to mark or something like that. And then other people have to do that too. For example, lawyers often, I mean, if they're drafting a new law or something, they need to clarify words, and words may need to be clarified in a court case. And so normally these clarifications happen in response to specific theoretical or practical difficulties, because it's not feasible that we just, as it were, work at making our language perfectly clear, because after all, the words that we're using to make the clarifications are themselves not perfectly clear, and that doesn't seem like a realistic aim. What does seem realistic and sensible is where some vagueness or unclarity or ambiguity in a word is causing trouble, that we then for specific purposes we clear up that unclarity so that we can use it more in a more effective way. And normally philosophers don't need to be called in for that. In fact, often the people who need to be called in are the people who are familiar with the subject matter. I mean, they might be the scientists or the lawyers or whoever it is. Of course, it's also true that in the same way, philosophers sometimes have to clarify their words, but that doesn't make philosophy exceptional. I mean, maybe we do more of that than people in other disciplines, but it's not that we're the only ones who do it. And we also have to ask, well, what are the specific difficulties that philosophical clarification is responding to? So normally the difficulties at issue they're not usually practical difficulties. But then if they're theoretical difficulties, I mean, we're not needed most of the time by other disciplines to clear up their problems. It must be that these difficulties, these theoretical difficulties, have arisen in philosophy itself. And so philosophy must be, a theoretical discipline after all to have the need for clarification. I mean, if philosophy was just, if its only task was to clear up the mess that it itself makes, then I think it would be better just to abolish philosophy. But if all it could do was to undo its own damage, then why have it in the first place? So, another way of thinking about this issue of clarification is to ask how it's achieved. And of course, sometimes it can be achieved by explicit definitions. But explicit definitions are not going to help if we're dealing with terms that are so basic that they can't be defined in even more basic terms. And that might well be the case with some terms that are important in philosophy. But I think it's just for the sake of another comparison, it's helpful to look at the case of the sciences, of other disciplines, and of course the science with the highest standards of clarity of all really is mathematics. And at least the way that mathematics is standardly developed, the most basic term in it is probably this symbol epsilon, for which means set membership. So X epsilon Y means X is a member of the set Y. And in mathematics, normally this epsilon is not defined in other terms. So question is, how is it clarified? Well, I think the best candidates for the kind of clarification that you need in order to use this symbol are just the standard axioms of set theory. And when you look at them, you see that they're not even implicit definitions of the symbol. They're just statements about it. So a typical example is a PSA, the power set axiom, and it says that for any set S, there's another set, well, it doesn't say it's another, but it always is in fact another set, P of S, whose members are all and only the subsets of S. So you can take you take a set, you look at all its subsets, and the subset relation is defined in terms of the membership relation, and then there's a set whose members are all those subsets of the original set. So that's just a statement made about sets using the membership relation. But that's the way in which the membership relation, in effect, gets clarified in mathematics. When people are introduced to set theory and to this membership relation, if we need anything more than a very kind of vague use of the term, then we'll have these axioms of set theory. And of course, the question, well, so how is it that just by laying down some axioms, we clarify a theoretical term? And I think the thing is, what we're doing there is we're making clearer what forms of reasoning with the term are legitimate and what forms are not legitimate. And you might think, well, doesn't that make the axioms conceptual truths or something like that after all, so that we would be back to that conceptual approach? But in fact, that's not the case. It doesn't preclude a competent speaker of the technical language from challenging an axiom. If somebody who's sufficiently expert in set theory proposes, for some reason, that there are counterexamples to the power set axiom, that certainly doesn't show that they don't understand this membership symbol. It's just that they think that we will get a more plausible theory of sets by denying this axiom, so that we're not getting anything like a conceptual truth here, but we are getting accepted principles that do clarify what arguments are going to be accepted, at least within this sub-community, and what are not. And that really is enough to get on with the mathematics. So what examples like that suggest, which is, as I say, an example from the science which is probably clearer than any other of how its most fundamental terms are explained. What they suggest is that basic terms are best clarified by providing informative theories involving them. And so at this fundamental level, it looks as though clarification without theory building may be a self-defeating enterprise. So as it were, there may be something fundamentally wrong-headed about the idea that clarification is an alternative aim for philosophy, by contrast with theory building, because clarification without theory building may, in the end, be a futile enterprise, especially when we're dealing with fundamental, more basic terms, as we tend to be in philosophy. And so, of course, that suggests that to the extent to which philosophy is involved in clarification, it had better also be involved in theory building. If philosophy builds theories, that makes it much more like other sciences. And then a further step, if we assume that the other sciences are ultimately seeking knowledge, then it would be plausible that philosophy too is seeking knowledge. Although I haven't given you an argument there for thinking of the other sciences as seeking knowledge, although it's pretty plausible in some broad sense. We might then wonder about where that leaves what was being called conceptual engineering. And in fact, if we take conceptual engineering at face value, it's going to inherit all the problems associated with the term concept. But if we just forget about concepts and think about linguistic engineering, I think we can see that there is a genuine and important phenomenon there, which is that we often need to introduce new terminology and notation to articulate new distinctions. As it were, it becomes important to draw a certain kind of line across logical space, and then it's going to be useful to have a word for that line. And I think the emphasis on the words themselves is actually quite useful here, because visible aspects of a notation can make a difference. It isn't all just to do with what concepts are involved. So, an example of the importance of a good notation, I think, is in the 18th century study of the calculus, where British mathematicians continued to use Newton's notation. Of course, Newton and Leibniz discovered the calculus more or less at the same time and more or less independently of each other. But whereas the continental European mathematicians, they used Leibniz's notation. And Leibniz's notation was more flexible than Newton's. And this partly explains why the continental European mathematicians made better progress than the British ones. As has been said, a good notation is like a good teacher. And so what we want is something that is just perspicuous in writing down the things that we need to write down. And that made, as I say, depend on even on visible features of the notation. And of course, choosing a good notation and making good distinctions is important in philosophy. But contrary to what some philosophers have recently suggested, that does not mean that philosophical disputes should be understood as what's sometimes called metalinguistic negotiation, and some kind of negotiation about what language we should speak. Because sometimes the disputes over which distinctions are good are really about which distinctions carve at the joints, in Plato's terminology. In other words, which distinctions, as it were, follow natural differences in the subject matter. And it can also be that sometimes two ways of talking are logically incompatible with each other, so that it can't be that, as it were, that both distinctions are okay, but we could just need to mark them by different terminology. So, for example, a language, and this is a result that can be proved, a language cannot contain both a negation that behaves according to classical logic and a negation that behaves according to intuitionistic logic, where intuitionistic logic rejects the law of excluded middle, that everything either is or is not the case. And because it turns out that if you try to have these two negations in the same language, they would collapse into each other, and therefore they couldn't be that one behaved according to one logic and the other according to a different logic. So it's not just that here are different things that we could mean by negation, by the word not or something. It's that there is a real theoretical dispute as to which logic is correct. So the conclusion that we're being drawn to is that philosophy is a theory-building discipline, in principle quite similar to other sciences, although we need to bear in mind that the sciences are not restricted to the natural sciences. So they include mathematics as well as natural sciences. Mathematics is a science too. And so the fact that philosophy is similar to the other sciences doesn't automatically mean that its method should be much more similar to that of the natural sciences, because we also have to think about the method of mathematics, which of course doesn't use experiments in the same kind of way as the natural sciences do. And the attempt to carve out a different kind of task for philosophy that wouldn't be like the task of the sciences has not gone well, as we've seen. So just looking forward to lecture 4, I mean, one obvious question is, well, if philosophy is like other sciences, what role do experiments play in it? As I said, that's a kind of open question for all we've said so far, because we've got different precedents here. I mean, if it's like mathematics, the role will be very small. If the role is like physics, the role will be very large. And so in the next lecture on Thursday, I'm going to discuss both thought experiments and real experiments and the role that they may play in philosophy. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. It's the time to give a very short. Yes, it's a time.
Yes.
It's a time to give a very short introduction to the interlocutor and the questioner. Dr. Chu is an associate professor of philosophy at Sichuan University. He specializes in philosophical logic, formal epistemology, philosophy of language, and the philosophy of philosophy. Dr. Dai Haiqiang is a lecturer at Beijing Normal University. He specializes in philosophy of language, Wittgenstein, normativity, and philosophy of dream. Then the time is for yes. Okay. Shi Zhaoqin.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be the interlocutor today. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Tim Williamson for his great talk, and thank Professor Chen Bo for his kind invitation. My comment consists of 2 parts. First, I will give a short summary of Williamson's talk. Then I will raise some questions which might need further clarification or worth discussion in their own right. Williamson starts with a crisis of aims and methods in philosophy. After scientific revolution, there seemed to be a mismatch between philosophy's traditional aims, that is, knowledge of reality, and its traditional method, that is, a priori reflection. If such a mismatch really exists, then philosophers naturally have 2 lines of responses. They could either change their aims or change their method. Tim's next lecture might be about an attempt on the second line. His lecture today focuses on 5 famous attempts on the first line. According to some philosophers, like Wittgenstein and Kant, and many others, the aim of philosophers is clarification of language or thought rather than knowledge of reality. Clarification could take the form of disambiguation, that is, clarification of words, or conceptual analysis, that is, clarification of concepts. It also promised a way out of the endless disputes of philosophers. However, Williamson argues that philosophy as clarification is as disputatious as any other kind of philosophy. Moreover, clarification becomes sterile, while it is not a response to specific difficulties in constructive theorism. And the most illuminating kinds of clarification themselves involve further constructive theorism. In the end, genuine clarification requires new knowledge of the entity. Thus, the role of clarification involves no radical contrast between philosophy and natural science. Williamson concludes that philosophy is a theory-building discipline in principle similar to other sciences, including mathematics as well as natural science. Here's something I think about. Williamson argues against philosophy as clarification, but he also admits that some clarifications, like choosing good notations or making good distinctions, are important in philosophy. So it is unclear what Williamson's final conclusion would be. This leads to my first question. So I have some questions for you. The first one is, what's your final view on the crisis of philosophy? Do you think there is no crisis of philosophy at all, or just clarification as philosophy is not a good enough response to it? This is the first question. The second question is, when you say philosophy's aim is knowledge of reality rather than clarification, what do you mean by reality? What do you think of another way of distinguishing philosophy from science, such as there is a saying that science studies facts while philosophy studies values? This is my second question. The third one is, when discussing the analytical synthetic distinction, you reject Quine's argument but accept his conclusion. What do you think of two other responses? One is to replace the distinction with some other ones, such as Jakob Hendekar's distinction between zero information and non-zero information. If the concept of information makes sense at all, then there is clearly a distinction between zero information and non-zero information, no matter how you define the concept of information. Or like Wittgenstein's distinction between tautologic or non-tautologic. And the other response is to just take the distinction between analytic and synthetic as basic, just as what you do with the distinction between knowledge and ignorance. Yeah, this is my third question. And my fourth question is, what is the relation between knowledge of reality and theory building? Is theory building a necessary way to get philosophical knowledge of reality? That's all of my questions. Thank you, Tim.
戴海强，戴海强，戴海强，怎么现身？
海强在吗？
戴海强，
好像我没说到10分钟是吧？
对，
海强。
戴海强
，OK，
有啊
，OK。
喂，
他说他网络有一点问题。
OK， Kim， 戴海强 have some internet problem, so you reply 徐昭清 question. Okay.
Something changed in his in his rectangle. I don't know whether he's able to speak now or not.
在海峡 have some problem with his internet, so you reply 石兆清's question first. Okay?
Yes. Right. Good. Well, thank you, Xiaoqing, for those interesting questions. So let me. I think you had 4. So so the first question was really, is there a crisis of method for philosophy? I mean, one which clarification is not a sufficient response to, and or is it that really there's no crisis at all? I don't think that the methodological problems for philosophy are bad enough anymore for them to deserve the name of a crisis, but I do think that we have a problem in fully understanding what our role is in relation to what the sciences are doing, and I think to some extent the problem is created by a lack of self-understanding on the part of philosophers of what they're doing, and I think that if philosophers have a wrong conception of what philosophical activity is, for example, that it's just clarification, then that itself is liable to lead to genuine methodological problems, because what people think about their aims and methods does have quite an impact on what their aims and methods actually are, and so I think if people think that what they're doing is clarification, then that is itself going to create problems for philosophy, given that this conception of philosophy doesn't really work. But even if we put aside, as it were, the aspects of the problem that are created by false models of what philosophy is or should be doing, I think it is a genuinely hard problem to fully understand what philosophy is up to, and I think that there are various kinds of indication of what we're doing, and I think that if we think of ourselves as a kind of highly theoretical science, but not a specifically natural science, although not completely divorced from natural science either, I think that's a step in the right direction, but I think there's a lot more to be done in the way of characterizing in what ways we're the same and in what ways we're different as other sciences, and I think there's also a lot more to be done in the way of actually following those methodological ideas out in practice. But I think it's not the case that philosophy. I think philosophy is of a kind of traditional armchair reflection kind. I think it's actually it's better off methodologically than many people think, but I think it also needs to improve its methodology. So we've got both an issue of description and an issue of prescription, but so when I say not a crisis, but some genuine problems about our methodology, both in theory and in practice. And then I think your second question was about characterizing the difference between philosophy and other disciplines, and I think one way of characterizing that you gave, at least as an example, was that it might be that as where other sciences study facts, but philosophy studies values. I don't think that quite gets it. But I mean, it's true that philosophers are much more willing to talk, in a fully engaged ways about values and about what are correct or incorrect values, or what to talk in normative terms. But there's quite a bit of philosophy that is not really to do with values. I mean, for example, metaphysics is mostly not about values. It's true that that when we're doing the metaphysics of ethics, then we're talking about values and their place in the world. But I think a lot of, in fact, most of the issues that are being discussed under the heading of metaphysics are not issues to do with values, and I think it's also the case that that philosophy is not the only subject that studies values. I mean, for example, social anthropology might be interested in questions about what values are held by different groups of people, or something like that. So I think that I think that although that there's that picks that way of contrasting with, it corresponds to some differences, quite important differences between philosophy and other stuff. But I don't think it actually draws the line in the right place. And I think there's probably no simple formula that does draw the line in the right place, because I think to some extent, as it were, what happens, what gets classified as philosophy and what gets classified as something else has to do with historical accidents about the way various disciplines have developed. So I don't think, as it were, philosophy has very natural boundaries. I think it's obvious that it tends to be interested in issues of a very theoretical kind at a high level of generality and abstraction, but I don't think that that's a definition of philosophy. So I think your third question was about whether there's some other way of drawing the line between the analytic and the synthetic, and I think as an example of that, you were suggesting maybe Hintiger's distinction between between zero information and non-zero information. I don't really find that helpful, and in fact, if you look at the history of discussions of information, they've had enormous problems in defining a workable criterion of sameness of information, which is closely related to the issue of zero information. And the trouble is that what you seem to be offered by such theories is really just a kind of stipulation about what's going to count as the same information and what's going to count as different information, and and what counts as zero information and what doesn't. And it's one where certain kinds of logical truths will count as giving zero information, and others won't, something along those lines. And it seems pretty arbitrary. And which truths give you new information depends on what your cognitive position happens to be in all sorts of maybe quite idiosyncratic ways, so that there isn't a natural divide between sentences which give no information and sentences which give some information. That just depends on the circumstances and the cognitive position of the person to whom one's speaking. And then the final question, the fourth question that you asked, was whether theory building is needed for knowledge of reality. And I think also, actually, you were also asking what I mean by reality. So by reality, I just mean, whatever there is. It's a word, everything. So I think that there's plenty of knowledge. I mean, all knowledge is knowledge of reality, as well. There's nothing else to know. But there's plenty of knowledge that we can get without theory building, at some kind of, at least at some sort of conscious level. Maybe some theories are built into our cognitive systems, but we're not talking about that. So I think, as it were, a lot of common sense knowledge does not depend on theory building. And, and I think even, for example, some historical knowledge doesn't depend on theory building. But I think when one is asking the kind of abstract, general questions that philosophy typically asks, questions for which common sense doesn't typically have an answer, then I don't think there's an alternative to theory building, because we've got to we need theories to tell us what the possible answers are, and then theories to give considerations favoring them. So I think that, as it were, if we're going to get knowledge of the things that philosophers have been interested in, I don't think there's any alternative to some kind of theory building. But that's not because it's a prerequisite for all knowledge. It's because of the kind of questions that we're asking. Right. Thanks.
Okay. 戴海强 is a Wittgenstein scholar. Williamson's conception of philosophy is radically different from Wittgenstein. So I expect maybe a really interesting question from 戴海强. Okay, your turn.
Sorry for my internet accent, and thanks for all your attention. Firstly, I want to thank Professor Chen for inviting me and the introduction, and also thanks for Professor Williamson for this great talk, which is very illuminating. Actually, I just have two questions. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, it's coming up.
Okay, great. Basically, I have two questions. One is a small one. Another is a quite general. I think maybe related with other commentators. But I think maybe I ask it from a different perspective. The first one actually concerning about the relation between understanding and knowledge, which I think is very crucial in Professor Williamson's today's talk, related with the clarification. As Professor Williamson claimed, the distinction between knowledge and understanding is not robust enough to be useful here. And I also quote from his book. In this passage, he used two examples to support the point that, quote, The idea of increasing understanding without increasing knowledge is an illusion, end quote. From my own understanding, I have some reservations actually, because this point seems to be doubtful. At first glance, there seems to be two types of relation between understanding and knowing. Type A, that is increasing understanding with increasing knowledge. In empirical area, as the examples Professor Williamson mentioned, I think this relation is true. But I think we also have another type relation. That means increasing understanding without increasing knowledge. In philosophical area, some cases are not just as same as in empirical area. Understanding is based on knowledge system, but sometimes understandings don't increase along with the increased knowledge. This is not to say there could be understanding without knowledge, but that they do not synchronize with each other. At this time, I think we can consider two cases. The first one is understanding philosophical questions themselves. For example, does time have special extension? How long is the Paris meter ruler? Understanding them is to recognize whether some questions are nonsense rather than to produce new knowledge about them. The second case is understanding specific contents of philosophical questions. For example, questions about the nature of truth, the meaning of life, the nature of normativity, etc. Understanding them doesn't give us new knowledge, but to see them more clearly. In those two cases, understanding is much more like insight, and increasing understanding does not increase knowledge, but rule out misunderstanding. Further, this actually introduces another question about the relation. Does increasing knowledge lead to increasing understanding? There seems to be another two types. The type C, that means increasing knowledge with increasing understanding. Example as Professor Williamson mentioned. The fourth is type D, increasing knowledge without increasing understanding. For example, in philosophy of mind, David Chalmers claimed that the hard problem of mind could not be resolved by the scientific knowledge, though there is a debate at this issue. For example, Jesse Prince claims that if you get more knowledge about the neural mechanism of brain, then you understand better what mind is. Under these considerations, Professor Williamson's contention perfectly fits with type A and C, but leaving type B and D untouched. As for his justification, example he used have their limitations since they only support type A and C. These empirical examples are different from examples as the truth, normativity, etc. Using them to deal with type B and D may lead to a favorable analogy. Thus, if I understand Professor Williamson's idea correctly, and those four types make sense, it seems that both Professor Williamson's undervaluation of the distinction between understanding and knowledge and his conclusion that philosophy is a theory-building discipline in principle similar to other science seem to be doubtful. The second question is quite general. This may be, as I said before, related to the whole series of lecture, including such topics as disagreement, clarification, and the relation between philosophy and natural science. Other commentators already raised a similar question, I'm sure, but I hope mine may ask it differently. When we think about philosophy itself, namely mind philosophy, where is the start point? In many cases, philosophy do disagree with each other about the nature of philosophy. In this case, what kind of argument could be useful to address this big question? It seems that there are two different cases in practice deserve to mention. The first one, for beginner, most likely they may start philosophy without a ready argument, but just do it due to their education system, ideology influenced by senior, intuition and flavor, etc. But those factors are like causal explanation, not reason justification. I assume in this case that cause is not identical with reason. In other words, those explanations are not philosophical. So should we who worry about this issue still wait for a strong reason to be found, or just consider the reality, namely doing philosophy blindly, since there is no final decisive answer to the reason? For mature thinkers, there are preconceived idea for both sides of an argument, especially in a radical case than a moderate case. For example, Wittgenstein would not agree that philosophy is constructive because they see philosophy as a curing disease, while others, like Professor Williamson, do not agree that philosophy is deconstructive because they see philosophy as personal knowledge. In these cases, is there any jury who doesn't have any preconception? Putting it more simply, is it possible for philosophy to start without bias? Is common sense enough on addressing this kind of question? I think I take too much time. Thanks.
No problem. No problem. Okay.
Right. Thank you very much. So let me take your two questions in turn. So one had to do with cases where we understand a question better, and you were suggesting these are cases where the increase in understanding doesn't go in with an increase in knowledge. But I think when we start unpacking what this increase in understanding is, I think we're going to find that it involves knowledge. So, for example, at the most basic level, understanding a question is a matter of knowing what the question means, and that's knowing what, which is that's actually a form of propositional knowledge. I mean, there are, of course, that's not the only way in which we might understand a question better. I mean, we might understand it better by learning what the point of the question is, why it's worth asking. But then what we're doing is we're gaining knowledge of why it's worth asking, and we might also understand it better by understanding its connection to other questions better. But that might involve just learning that it has such and such connections with other questions. And again, that's gaining knowledge. And then another kind of example you're giving was ones where we might learn that a certain question is we might come to understand that a certain question is meaningless. I think you were giving the question, how long is the Paris meter ruler, as an example of a meaningless question. I mean, I don't myself agree that it's meaningless. I think it's just that it's kind of trivial that the answer is it's 1 meter long. And I think will be implied by any proper theory of length. But I mean, suppose we did have a genuinely meaningless question. I think, if it's meaningless, it's not that you can understand the question better, but you can understand something about the question better, which is you can come to understand that it's a meaningless question. But I think that's also a matter of coming to know that it's a meaningless question. And so those are the kind of moves that I'd be making about, to sort of probing these increases in understanding. And I'd make some with some of the other examples that you gave as well. But I think one thing that was interesting was that you compared understanding better to seeing something more clearly, which is, I mean, I think it's a perfectly good metaphor, but I think seeing something more clearly means, I mean, what it involves is being in a position to gain. I mean, if we just take it literally, we're in a position to gain more knowledge about something when we see it more clearly. I mean, for example, if we see, if we see somebody through the mist, and when they come more, when we start seeing, as they come closer, we see them more clearly, and then we may be able to recognize who it is, or even if it's a stranger, because we see them more clearly, we gain knowledge, whether they're a man or a woman, what clothes they're wearing, what color hair they have, all those kind of things. So that actually, I think the metaphor of seeing more clearly suggests a very strong connection with knowledge. So that's what I'd say about your first question. About the second question, which was, so that was to do with what kind of reasons we might have for doing philosophy, and also whether there's some kind of unbiased jury, who could adjudicate these disputes. So I think, it may be that there is not a completely unbiased jury that that in order to understand what's at issue between these different conceptions of philosophy, you have to be trained to some extent in philosophy, and that training itself will involve some kind of bias to one view or another. And and I think, but I don't think that's such a terrible situation to be in, because I think that the right way of resolving it is not really just to have as one as it were shootout where we try to decide once and for all which conception of philosophy is better. I think it's more appropriate just to let proponents of each view of philosophy develop their view as best they can by doing philosophy in the way they think appropriate, and then I think in the long run it often becomes it typically becomes clear that that one of these views is actually making some progress and the other is just stagnating. And I don't, in fact, think that this is very different from the situation in say in the natural sciences. I mean, if suppose that we have let's say 2 research programs in physics or something like that. I mean, the only people who are in a position to adjudicate between them will be people who have who are very extensively, very well educated in physics to understand what both research programs involve, and once they're in that position, it's almost certain that that the kind of training that they've received will bias them in one direction or another, and so I don't think that we should expect. Even in the case of physics, so to be a neutral jury which can just decide. What I was suggesting in the case of both philosophy and the natural sciences is that the mechanism is a more long-term one, in which, as it were, in the end, the decision is made by people as to which research program they're going to work on. And some research programs are able to renew themselves and to produce new, as it were, recruit new members and so on. And others, just tend in the long run to dry up. Although often, I mean, they will continue to get some adherence for a long time. And that's achieved not by some completely decisive argument, but by each side being given the chance to develop its approach. And for example, in the case of the conceptions of philosophy as clarification, those are conceptions which were given a long run in 20th century philosophy, and I think the fact that they weren't really able in any effective way to substantiate, let's say, the distinction between conceptual and non-conceptual truths or something, that they were given their opportunity and they couldn't take it. In the long run, I think that is the kind of consideration which will tell against them. But I agree that if this is what you're suggesting, that there is no such thing as some completely unbiased jury which, as it were, understands enough of the alternatives to be able to be the judge in the case. But I don't actually think that we need such a judge.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Williamson, Professor 石道清, Dr. 戴海强. Let us meet here again on Thursday night to attend Williamson's fourth, yes, philosophy and thought